There's one person here who became absolutely indispensable to me.
Chloe, come up here. You're the heartbeat of this.
I stood in my $5,000 Oscar de la Renta gown, surrounded by New York's elite, listening to my husband of 10 years attribute his entire empire to a 24-year-old assistant in a cheap silk slip dress. He thought I'd cry. Instead, I destroyed his life with a single phone call. If you had asked me the day before the gala if I loved my husband, I would have said yes without hesitation. Richard and I were a team, or, at least, that was the lie I had been telling myself for the better part of a decade. We built Hayes Global Logistics from the ground up, starting in a suffocatingly small, one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. Richard had the charisma, the silver tongue, the jawline that made investors want to hand him a blank check, but I had the brains. While he was out whining and dining venture capitalists, I was the one sitting on our thrifted sofa at 3 a.m., coding the proprietary routing algorithm that would eventually revolutionize supply chain management. When the company finally launched, we made a strategic decision. The tech world, especially logistics, was fiercely male-dominated. Investors responded to Richard's alpha male bravado. They didn't respond to a quiet, analytical woman trying to explain data points. So, I stepped back. I let Richard be the face, the CEO, the visionary. I took the title of consultant, quietly running the back end, refining the software, and legally retaining the patent to the algorithm in my own private LLC, a safety measure my late father, a corporate attorney, practically forced me to set up before he passed away. Richard had laughed at the time, calling it paranoid, but he signed the licensing agreement anyway because he needed my tech to get the initial funding. For 7 years, it was beautiful. We moved to a penthouse in Manhattan. We vacationed in St. Bart's. We were the ultimate power couple, even if no one knew I was the power. Then came Chloe. Chloe Jenkins was hired 2 years ago as Richard's executive assistant. She was 24, fresh out of NYU, with wide doe eyes and a habit of laughing just a little too loudly at Richard's jokes. At first, I didn't think much of her. She fetched his coffee, organized his calendar, and sent me polite, overly punctuated emails about Richard's flight schedules. But then, the subtle shifts began. It started with his wardrobe. I had always picked out Richard's suits. One evening, he came home wearing a striking Tom Ford tie I had never seen before. When I complimented it, he smirked and adjusted the knot. Chloe picked it up for me on her lunch break. Kid has a surprisingly good eye for men's fashion, doesn't she? Then, it was his schedule. Dinners we used to share on Friday nights were suddenly canceled due to late-night strategy sessions that Chloe just had to sit in on to take notes. When I visited the office, Chloe would greet me not as the founder's wife, but as a guest intruding on her territory. "Oh, Madeline," she would chirp, entirely bypassing the respectful Mrs. Hayes. "Richard is super slammed right now. He and I are just finalizing the Q3 projections. I can squeeze you in for 5 minutes, though?" I brought it up to Richard once. Just once. We were in our kitchen, the marble island cold against my elbows, as I watched him text someone at 11 p.m. "She oversteps, Richard," I had said, keeping my voice level. "She acts like she's your partner, not your assistant." Richard had sighed, dramatically putting his phone face down. "Maddie, please, don't be one of those wives. Chloe is just young and eager. She anticipates my needs before I even say them. She's indispensable right now, especially with the board breathing down my neck about the merger." He made me feel crazy. He gaslit me so flawlessly that I actually apologized. My best friend Evelyn warned me. We were at brunch at Balthazar when she leaned over her mimosa and looked me dead in the eye. "Maddie, you are blind. The girl doesn't want his calendar. She wants his life." I saw them at a business luncheon on Tuesday. She was practically sitting in his lap, and he wasn't stopping her. I defended him. I told Evelyn she was reading into things. I told myself that Richard was just stressed, that the upcoming 10-year anniversary of the company and the potential acquisition by a massive European conglomerate was getting to him. I ignored the red flags. I ignored the faint smell of Le Labo perfume on his coats. I ignored the fact that he changed his phone passcode. I was a fool. But a fool with a trapdoor built into her husband's empire. The 10th anniversary of Hayes Global Logistics was the social and corporate event of the season. It was held at the Waldorf Astoria, in a ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with white orchids. Every major investor, tech mogul, and socialite in New York was there. I spent 4 hours getting ready. I wore a custom sapphire blue Oscar de la Renta gown that hugged every curve, my hair swept up in a classic chignon. I wore the diamond tennis bracelet Richard had bought me for our 5th anniversary. When I walked out of the dressing room, Richard looked at me, gave a tight, distracted smile, and said, "You look nice. We need to hurry. The press is already there." "No, you look stunning." No kiss, just a check of his Rolex. When we arrived, the flashbulbs were blinding. Richard played the perfect CEO, shaking hands, flashing his $1,000,000 smile, posing for photos. I stood faithfully by his side, playing the elegant, supportive wife. Halfway through the cocktail hour, I noticed Chloe. She wasn't dressed like staff. She was wearing a silver silk slip dress that left absolutely nothing to the imagination, her hair styled in loose, bedroom waves. She was floating through the crowd, speaking to our board members with an unearned familiarity. Every time I looked over, she was laughing, touching an investor's arm, or catching Richard's eye across the room. Evelyn, looking fierce in red, materialized beside me and handed me a glass of champagne. "Tell me you see this," she muttered. "I see it," I whispered, maintaining my serene smile for the cameras. "She's just trying to network. Let her make a fool of herself." "She's not the one looking like a fool right now, Maddie," Evelyn said softly, a hint of genuine pity in her voice. That pity stung worse than a slap. Dinner was served, and the room buzzed with the energy of extreme wealth and impending success. The European conglomerate was expected to officially announce their acquisition of Hayes Global for $800 million by the end of the month. Everyone was celebrating. Everyone was rich. Then, it was time for the speeches. David, the CFO, spoke first, praising Richard's vision. Then, the room quieted as Richard took the stage. The spotlight hit him, and he looked incredibly handsome. He tapped the microphone, and the crowd chuckled. 10 years, Richard began, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. 10 years ago, Hayes Global was just an idea, a wild, impossible dream. People told me the logistics industry was too saturated. They told me our algorithm would never scale. He paused, looking out over the crowd. My heart swelled slightly, despite the distance between us lately. This was it. This was the moment he would acknowledge the late nights, the sacrifices, the fact that I built the algorithm he was currently boasting about. I adjusted my posture, preparing for the spotlight to shift to our table. "But I didn't do this alone," Richard continued, his voice dropping into that serious, intimate tone he used to close deals. "A CEO is only as strong as the people who hold him up when the pressure is too much. There is one person in this room who has been my absolute rock, someone who works 20-hour days, who understands my vision even better than I do sometimes, and who has sacrificed their own life to make sure this company reaches its highest potential." I felt Evelyn's hand touch my arm under the table. I smiled softly, looking up at my husband. "I couldn't have survived this last year, let alone this acquisition, without her," Richard said, his eyes scanning the room. "But they didn't land on me. They swept right past my table." "Chloe, come up here," Richard said, a massive, affectionate smile breaking across his face. The ballroom went dead silent for a fraction of a second. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears. Chloe, feigning surprise, covered her mouth and giggled. She stood up from a table near the front, a table she had absolutely no business sitting at, and glided up the stairs to the stage. I stopped breathing. The blood drained from my face, pooling somewhere in my stomach like lead. Richard wrapped his arm tightly around Chloe's bare waist and pulled her to his side. "Ladies and gentlemen, Chloe Jenkins, the unsung hero of Hayes Global. She is the heartbeat of this operation, and the most fiercely loyal partner a CEO could ask for." The use of the word partner, the physical intimacy of his hand resting on her hip, the absolute erasure of my existence in front of 500 of our peers, investors, and friends. The applause that followed was hesitant, confused, and deeply uncomfortable. People were clapping, but their eyes were darting to me. I could feel the weight of 100 stares. I could hear the whispers starting at the adjacent tables. "Isn't that his wife? Why did he call the assistant up? Did you see the way he's holding her?" Evelyn's grip on my arm was bruising. "Maddie," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "Stand up, walk out, now." But I didn't move. I sat there, frozen in time, staring at the stage. Chloe leaned into the microphone, breathless and radiant. Thank you, Richard. Working by your side every single day and night. She paused. A deliberate, suggestive pause that made my stomach churn. Has been the greatest privilege of my life. We make a great team. Richard beamed at her. He didn't even look in my direction as they stepped down from the podium together. In that moment, the love I had for Richard Hayes didn't just die. It evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. I saw the last 10 years for what they were. I was a stepping stone, a tool he used to build a throne that he now intended to share with a girl 10 years my junior. He had publicly humiliated me. He had declared his allegiance to her in front of the people who held our financial future in their hands. He thought I was weak. He thought I would go home, cry into my silk pillowcase, and accept a quiet divorce with a standard settlement to avoid a scandal. He forgot who wrote the code. I didn't throw my drink. I didn't scream. I didn't march up to Chloe and slap her across her smug, glowing face, no matter how much my hands physically ached to do it. Instead, I took a slow sip of my champagne, placed the crystal flute gently on the white tablecloth, and stood up. I'll be right back, I said to Evelyn, my voice frighteningly calm. I walked out of the ballroom. The whispers trailed behind me like ghosts, but I kept my spine straight and my chin parallel to the floor. I walked through the opulent lobby of the Waldorf, the click of my heels echoing off the marble floors. I walked outside into the crisp Manhattan air. The valet immediately stepped forward. Mrs. Hayes, shall I call your driver? Yes, please, I said. A moment later, our black Lincoln Navigator pulled up. Henry, our driver for the last 5 years, jumped out to open the door. He took one look at my face, and his professional smile dropped. Ma'am, is everything all right? Is Mr. Hayes joining you? No, Henry, I said, sliding into the leather seat. Mr. Hayes will be finding his own way home tonight, and probably for the rest of his life. Henry didn't ask questions. He closed the door. Where to, Mrs. Hayes? The penthouse, I said. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving the glittering lights of the hotel behind, I opened my clutch and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking, not from sorrow, but from adrenaline. I opened my files. I scrolled past the photos of our anniversary in Paris, past the texts from Richard lying about his whereabouts, and opened a heavily encrypted PDF folder. 10 years ago, when Richard and I drafted the licensing agreement for the routing algorithm, I made sure my father's old firm handled the paperwork. The algorithm, the very brain of Hayes Global, the exact technology the European conglomerate was paying $800 million to acquire, did not belong to the company. It belonged to Zenith Solutions LLC, a company of which I was the sole proprietor. The licensing agreement was rock solid, but it had a revocation clause, a morals and disparagement clause, technically buried on page 47. If the CEO of the company acted in a way that publicly damaged the reputation of the licensor, or if the board attempted an acquisition without the licensor's direct, written approval, I could pull the license, immediately, without a grace period. Hayes Global Logistics, without my algorithm, was just a bunch of empty warehouses and delivery trucks. It was worth nothing. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. The phone rang twice before a deep, gruff voice answered. Madeline, do you know what time it is? Hello, Thomas, I said, leaning back into the leather seat. Thomas Lexington was the senior partner at Lexington and Cross, my late father's protege, and the most ruthless corporate litigator in New York. It's 10:15 on a Friday, Thomas sighed. Aren't you at the 10-year gala for Richard's company? I saw the spread in the journal this morning. I was, I replied, my voice steady. I left early. Richard just gave a speech attributing the entire success of the company to his 24-year-old assistant, right before he put his hands all over her in front of the European buyers. Silence on the other end of the line. The kind of sharp, professional silence that indicated Thomas was shifting from family friend to legal shark. Are you absolutely sure, Maddie? I have 500 witnesses, Thomas, including the press. He humiliated me. I see. What do you want to do? The acquisition by the Europeans is supposed to go into due diligence on Monday, correct? That's the word on the street, Thomas confirmed. Richard stands to walk away with about $400 million personally. Not anymore, I whispered. the words tasting sweet on my tongue. I want you to trigger the revocation clause on the patent license. All of it. Pull the algorithm from Hayes Global servers. Thomas let out a low whistle. Maddie, if I do that, the company's valuation drops to zero by Monday morning. The European deal will instantly collapse. Richard will be facing breach of contract lawsuits from his own investors. It will be a bloodbath. He'll be bankrupt. I know. I looked out the tinted window as we sped down Park Avenue. I want the cease and desist delivered to him personally. Tonight, I want it handed to him while he's still at the after-party with her. It will take me about an hour to draft the emergency injunction and get a courier to the hotel, Thomas said, and I could hear the aggressive clicking of his keyboard in the background. Are you prepared for the fallout, Madeline? He is going to lose his mind. Let him, I said. He wanted to show everyone who the real power behind the company was. I'm just helping him clarify the narrative. Consider it done. I'll call you when the courier makes the drop. I hung up the phone and let out a long, shuddering breath. I looked at the diamond bracelet on my wrist, the one he bought me with money generated by my code. I unclasped it and let it fall onto the floor of the SUV. Richard Hayes thought he was the king of the world tonight. He thought he could replace the queen with a pawn and keep the kingdom. He was about to find out that the castle was built on my land, and I was evicting him. The penthouse was suffocatingly quiet when I stepped out of the private elevator. The sprawling 5,000-square-foot duplex overlooking Central Park had always felt like a fortress, a testament to everything Richard and I had built. Tonight, it just felt like a crime scene. I didn't bother turning on the main lights. The amber glow of the city filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows was enough. I kicked off my Jimmy Choo heels, leaving them abandoned on the Persian rug, and walked straight into the master suite. I pulled my largest Louis Vuitton trunk from the walk-in closet and threw it open on the California king bed. I didn't pack everything. I didn't care about the designer gowns Richard had bought me as apologies for missed anniversaries, or the expensive handbags that were supposed to make up for his emotional absence. I packed my essentials, my mother's jewelry, and, most importantly, my backup hard drives. As I folded a cashmere sweater, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Evelyn. Evie. Oh my God, Maddie, where are you? Me, home, packing. What's happening? Evie, you are a terrifying genius. A guy in a trench coat just walked right past the velvet ropes at the VIP after-party. Evie. He handed Richard a thick manila envelope. Richard was mid-laugh, holding a fresh martini, with Chloe practically draped over his shoulder. Evie. Maddie, I have never seen a man turn gray before. Literally gray. He dropped his glass. It shattered everywhere. I stared at the screen, a dark, primal satisfaction unfurling in my chest. Evie. He's screaming at David now. David is looking at the papers and pulling his hair out. Chloe is trying to touch Richard's arm, and he just violently shoved her hand away. It is absolute chaos here. The Kaufman Group executives are staring at them. He's leaving, he's storming out. I locked my phone and took a deep breath. The clock on the nightstand read 1:14 a.m. I zipped my suitcase, dragged it into the foyer, and walked into my home office. I sat down at my mahogany desk, opened my MacBook, and logged into the Zenith Solutions master terminal. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in the administrative credentials. A loading bar appeared on the screen, connecting directly to the Hayes Global Logistics server infrastructure. The front door of the penthouse slammed open with enough force to rattle the artwork in the hallway. Madeline. Richard's voice was a jagged roar, echoing off the marble floors. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded down the hallway. I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the glowing screen of my laptop. He burst into the office, his tuxedo jacket gone, his bow tie undone, and his hair disheveled. He was clutching the manila envelope Thomas had sent, his knuckles white. For the first time in the 10 years I had known him, Richard Hayes looked completely unhinged. "What is this?" he screamed, throwing the thick stack of legal documents onto my desk. The papers slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from my keyboard. "What the hell did you just do?" I looked up at him, my expression entirely blank. "I believe the paperwork is self-explanatory, Richard. I've revoked the licensing agreement for the Zenith routing algorithm, effective immediately." "You can't do this!" He slammed both hands down on the desk, leaning over me, his chest heaving. "This is my company. We are days away from an $800 million buyout. You are destroying everything we worked for. No, Richard, I corrected, my voice dangerously soft. You destroyed everything I worked for. You just spent the last 2 hours parading a 24-year-old child in front of our investors, crediting her with the success of a company that runs entirely on my intellectual property. You wanted everyone to know she's your partner. Well, let's see how much she can do without my code. It was a speech, Maddie. A stupid PR-friendly speech, he pleaded, his anger suddenly fracturing into desperate backpedaling. The classic Richard Hayes pivot. Chloe is just an assistant. She appeals to the younger demographic. The board thought it would be a good look to highlight youthful female leadership in the company. It meant nothing. You really think I'm that stupid? I asked, standing up so I was eye to eye with him. You think I don't smell her cheap perfume on your shirts? You think I don't know you changed your passcode because you're sleeping with her? You didn't just sleep with her, Richard. You tried to replace me. You erased me. Maddie, please. He reached out, trying to grab my wrists. I stepped back, disgusted. We can fix this. I'll fire her. I'll fire Chloe right now. I'll call David. We'll put out a press release tomorrow. We'll put your name on the board of directors. Just call Thomas. Call Thomas and stop this injunction. If the servers go down, the Kaufman Group walks. We lose everything. I don't lose anything, I stated simply. Zenith Solutions is an LLC entirely in my name. The prenuptial agreement you practically shoved in my face 10 years ago because you were convinced you were going to be a billionaire and I was just a liability protects all my separate business entities. I own the tech. You own a brand name and a fleet of leased trucks. Richard stared at me, the blood draining from his face as the reality of his own hubris crashed down on him. You wouldn't, he whispered, his eyes darting to my laptop screen. Watch me. I reached down and pressed the enter key. On the screen, a terminal window executed a command line. It was the kill switch. Within seconds, the proprietary routing software that managed thousands of global shipping routes, automated warehouse sorting, and real-time tracking for Hayes Global Logistics was scrubbed from their active servers. I had built the backdoor into the architecture years ago, a failsafe in case of a hostile corporate takeover. I just never expected the hostile takeover to come from my own husband. Instantly, Richard's phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was David. Then a second line beeped in. The head of IT. The entire grid just went dark, Richard breathed, staring at his phone in absolute horror. The logistics network is offline. Cargo ships in the Pacific are losing their routing coordinates. The system, it's gone. Consider it a forced reboot, I said, closing my laptop and slipping it into my leather tote bag. You and Chloe have a long night ahead of you. I suggest you start drafting an apology to the Kaufman Group. You vindictive bitch, Richard snarled, stepping toward me, his face twisting into something ugly and violent. I'll sue you for everything you have. I'll tie you up in litigation for the rest of your miserable life. You breached this contract, and I will destroy you. Thomas Lexington is already waiting for your call, I replied, entirely unfazed. But before you threaten me, you might want to look at page 72 of the injunction. Richard frantically flipped through the documents on the desk. I conducted a full security audit of the network before I pulled the plug, I explained, walking toward the door. Your brilliant, indispensable assistant has been forwarding confidential quarterly projections to a private server for the last 6 months, a server owned by Omni Logistics, our biggest competitor. Richard froze. He looked up, his mouth slightly open. She wasn't sleeping with you because you're charming, Richard, I said, feeling a twisted sense of pity for the man I used to love. She was committing corporate espionage. And because you gave her unrestricted executive access, she had the keys to the kingdom. You didn't just betray your wife, you breached fiduciary duty to your shareholders. I picked up the handle of my Louis Vuitton trunk. My lawyers will be in touch regarding the divorce. Enjoy the ashes of your empire. I walked out the front door, leaving Richard standing alone in the dark, surrounded by the deafening ring of a dozen unanswered phone calls. By 9 a.m. on Monday, the financial world was in a state of unmitigated chaos. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page exclusive that I had framed for my office by noon. Hayes Global in freefall. Tech blackout derails $800 million merger. I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Lexington and Cross, feeling a profound sense of calm as I sipped a black coffee. Thomas sat beside me, meticulously sorting through a mountain of injunction responses and panicked legal inquiries from Hayes Global's scrambling legal team. Across the polished table sat Eleanor Cunningham, the ruthlessly sharp, silver-haired CEO of the Kaufman Group. Eleanor wasn't just anyone. She was a veteran shark who had cut her teeth at Goldman Sachs in the 90s before taking over Kaufman, and she commanded a room with terrifying ease. When the Hayes network collapsed on Friday night, Eleanor didn't panic like the rest of the board. She made a single phone call. She bypassed Richard entirely and called the one person who actually understood the proprietary technology holding the deal together: me. We had spent the entire weekend locked in quiet, intense negotiations. The board of Hayes Global convened an emergency meeting at 6 o'clock this morning, Thomas announced, adjusting his spectacles and pushing a thick dossier across the table toward me. It was a bloodbath, Maddie. The investors, especially the heavy hitters from Sequoia Capital, are out for blood. The valuation of Hayes Global plummeted by 80% before the market even opened. And Richard? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly neutral, though a spark of satisfaction ignited in my chest. Ousted, Thomas said with a grim, predatory smile. Terminated with absolute cause. The board discovered the data leak you flagged regarding Chloe Jenkins. David, the CFO, personally handed Richard his termination papers. They are stripping him of his equity to cover the impending tsunami of lawsuits. He has literally nothing left to bargain with. Eleanor Cunningham chuckled softly, elegantly stirring her Earl Grey tea. Men like Richard Hayes are incredibly predictable, Madeline. They mistake their own massive egos for actual competence. The moment my tech analysts at Kaufman looked at the back-end architecture of the routing algorithm during preliminary due diligence, they told me it was the work of an absolute genius. And when I met Richard at the Waldorf, listening to him bloviate about synergy and disruptive logistics, I knew immediately he wasn't the genius in the room. Thank you, Eleanor, I said, offering a genuine, steady smile. So, Eleanor leaned forward, folding her manicured hands on the table. The warmth left her face, replaced by pure business acumen. Let's talk about our future. The Kaufman Group does not need Hayes Global's leased warehouses, nor do we need their bloated middle management. We have our own physical infrastructure throughout Europe and Asia. What we wanted was the brain of the operation. We want Zenith Solutions. Zenith is a strictly independent entity, I said, opening my leather portfolio and sliding a crisp, newly drafted term sheet toward her. And I am willing to grant the Kaufman Group an exclusive 10-year licensing agreement for the global routing algorithm. But I am done being a silent consultant, Eleanor. I am done operating in the shadows so a man can stand in the spotlight. I want a designated seat on the executive board. I want the title of Chief Technology Officer for your new North American division. And I want the initial licensing fee to be $200 million, wired to my private accounts up front. Eleanor didn't blink. She didn't flinch at the astronomical figure. She looked at me with deep, profound respect, the kind of respect Richard had never bothered to show me. 250 million, Eleanor countered smoothly, her eyes locking onto mine. But you commit to a minimum of 5 years in the CTO role, and you personally oversee the architecture of an entirely new AI predictive module for our Asian shipping routes by next quarter. Deal, I said, extending my hand firmly across the table. As we shook on the agreement, finalizing the destruction of my husband's legacy and the launch of my own, my phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number, but the automated voicemail transcription immediately popped up on my screen. I glanced down at it. It was Richard. Maddie, please, you have to call me back. The board took everything. My accounts are completely frozen. Chloe took off. She cleared out the joint checking account I set up for her, took the Tesla, and blocked my number. The SEC just raided the corporate office about the Omni Logistics leak. I'm facing federal charges, Maddie. Federal charges. Please, you're the only one who can explain the code to the feds. I need you. I'm sorry. I was an idiot. I'm so sorry. I stared at the transcribed words, feeling absolutely nothing for the man who had once been my entire world. I deleted the voicemail, blocked the number, and turned my phone face down. 2 months later, the dust finally settled over the Manhattan skyline. Hayes Global Logistics officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. without my algorithm to optimize their routes. Their severely outdated legacy logistics models collapsed under the weight of modern supply chain demands. Their stock plummeted to literal pennies, and their remaining assets were aggressively liquidated to pay off furious creditors. Richard's downfall was spectacularly brutal and highly public. The corporate espionage scandal broke wide open on every major financial network. It turned out Chloe Jenkins wasn't just a naive, starstruck 24-year-old assistant. She was a highly compensated corporate spy, deliberately placed there by Omni Logistics to honey-trap Richard. He had eagerly handed over top-tier company secrets between glasses of champagne and stolen, pathetic weekends at the Plaza Hotel. He was currently fighting a massive, multi-million-dollar class-action lawsuit from his former investors and was permanently barred by the SEC from acting as an executive in any publicly traded company. He was living in a rented, drab, one-bedroom apartment in Queens, drowning in legal fees and public disgrace. As for Chloe, Omni Logistics immediately threw her under the bus the moment the federal investigators started sniffing around their servers. She was facing her own severe legal battles for corporate espionage and wire fraud, completely banished from the high society world she had tried so desperately to infiltrate. And me? I was standing on the top floor of a gleaming, state-of-the-art glass skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, looking out over the sprawling city below. The heavy frosted gold lettering on the glass doors behind me read, Kaufman Zenith Innovations. Madeline Hayes, Chief Technology Officer. I kept his last name. I decided I absolutely loved the bitter irony of plastering it on a far more successful, powerful company than he could ever dream of building. Evelyn walked into my new, massive corner office, holding 2 crystal glasses of vintage Dom Perignon. She handed me one, her eyes sparkling with fierce pride. To the invisible architect, Evelyn toasted, clinking her glass against mine, the crystal ringing out like a bell. Who isn't so invisible anymore? To outsmarting them all, I replied, taking a long, satisfying sip of the crisp champagne. I looked down at the bustling, microscopic cars on the streets below. For 10 long years, I had shrunk myself to fit neatly into the shadow of a man who didn't deserve a fraction of my light. I had let him take the credit, take the thunderous applause, and take my unwavering loyalty for granted. He thought he held all the winning cards simply because he was the one standing on the stage. But I was the one who built the stage, and I was the one who knew exactly where the trapdoors were hidden. He chose his assistant over me in front of everyone. He thought it would be the tragic end of my story. Instead, it was just the prologue. What would you have done if you were in Madeline's shoes? Would you have pulled the plug, or tried to save the empire? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge and corporate karma, make sure to hit that like button, share it with a friend who loves a satisfying plot twist, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life drama stories every single week. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an update.